I'm not. I don't drink coffee. Well,
So what do you do when you get up in the morning? What's your...
Diet Coke.
Oh.
I'm not against the caffeine. I just don't drink coffee.
Cindy, I am so opposed to everything you are.
Yeah, that's funny.
You just wake up,
I will take that as a compliment.
I'm kidding, of course.
They're very portable. You can just
like-
stash them everywhere. That's a good thing.
Amazing. Well, it's not election day anymore. It's the day after. We're drinking our quad shot lattes and our Diet Cokes, and it's time for Sound Politics. You're listening to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
I'm Amy Radil. I'm in for Libby Denkman.
And you heard it here first, everyone. Election night in Washington State isn't that exciting. So many ballots left to count, so many potential changes in the coming days. It is one of the few downsides of the vote by mail system. I'm curious, Amy, have you ever covered an in-person voting election? Like, are they more fun?
They're so much more fun and more dramatic. I mean, I remember when people would give concession speeches that were very emotional on election night because they would see the writing on the wall, and that never happens anymore.
Well, a boring election night never stopped us from doing an analysis episode the next day, and we actually do have some likely winners. I think the TV news Chiron is Democrats ahead in the legislative races, a tight race for King County executive, but leaning toward one candidate. Yeah, what would you say?
Well, and in Seattle City Hall, a few clear incumbent losses, and then we have one big nail-biter ahead for the mayor's race.
So that's the headlines. Let's get into the details with our guests. Our guests today are Sandeep Kaushik, a political consultant, and he can be heard on the podcasts Seattle Nice and Blue City Blues. Hey, Sandeep.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And Raven Tyler is a political consultant with Northwest Passage Consulting. Raven, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so before we go any further, let's get some disclaimers out of the way, okay? Because other than Amy, I think we are all compromised. I'll go first. I'm dating the Seattle mayor's press secretary. So who have you, I'm curious for our two consultants, who have you been consulting with locally this election season? Sandeep, let's start with you.
Yeah, the only race I've been formally doing is a independent expenditure campaign in the 33rd Legislative District House race, and that's a South County district. That was really a Democrat-on-Democrat race between Kevin Schilling and the incumbent Edwin Obras, and I was doing the IE on the Schilling.
And I just want to be clear that both of you work with nonpartisan candidates. I think mostly Democrats. Raven, you can tell me if I'm wrong about that, but different kinds of Democrats, which is, let's be honest, a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about Seattle area races. So Raven, your firm, Northwest Passage Consulting, is working with a lot of names people would recognize. Bruce Harrell, Alexis Mercedes Rink, Claudia Balducci. Who have you personally been working with this campaign cycle?
Yeah, so this campaign cycle had a lot of really good candidates, and so I guess I'll start north and work my way down to Pierce County. So I worked with Leah Wayman. She is running for Bellingham City Council. Chris Eck is running for re-election for Edmond City Council, and then the Erica Evans, who ran and won Seattle City Attorney, Claire Sumadewara in Bellevue City Council, Noreen Breyer in Bellevue City Council, Melissa Bedford, she's running for Puyallup School Board, Latasha Palmer in Tacoma City Council, and Zev Cook for Tacoma City Council. So just a bunch of folks.
Busy, yeah. Before we get to your big takeaways, let's just talk about the big cliffhanger in the coming days, whether Bruce Harrell will keep his 7-point lead in the Seattle mayor's race or challenger Katie Wilson will creep up on him. What do you both think? And Raven, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a nail biter. It's going to be super, super close. I don't know if it'll be necessarily keeping the 7-point lead. We know that as ballots come in, they tend to lean more left, even though they're both Democrats in the race. And so it'll be very close. I'm waiting with bated breath, and our text message, our group chat is going crazy all day.
Many group chats are going crazy. What about you, Sandy?
Yeah, well, mine too. And there's been a lot of number crunching, going on in my world. But look, I would say Katie Wilson currently is favored to win. And the reason I say that is that if you look at the last three mayoral races, the shift between election day and the final count for the moderate candidate has been a loss of 4.5 points about. And right now, the mayor, Bruce Harrell, is at 53.3. So he has about a 3.5 point delta that he can lose and still win. There's a little bit of a write-in vote that gets sliced off the top, so he doesn't have to get to exactly 50. So if he loses 4.5 points, he's going to lose to Katie Wilson probably by almost 2 points, right? Because there'll be a shift over to her. Now, the counter argument in the 2021 mayoral race where Bruce Harrell defeated Lorena Gonzalez, the shift, he was up by 24 points. It was a blowout race, but he was up by 24 points on election night, and he ended up winning by 17. So it ended up being a 6.69% decline in his margin of victory. That's a little bit less than the 7.1% margin that he leads by. So if that's the shift that happens this time, he'll squeak it out by a few votes, right? So you could argue it either way, but I would say the preponderance of the evidence says that the shift will probably be a little bit bigger than 7 points, but who knows?
Numbers are we're talking about, like, we're really diving into the details of the numbers and the number crunching, but the big picture is, right, that leftists vote late, as we often say, or
That's
progressives. Right. I like to say progressives procrastinate, just because I'm
that.
special. Yeah. And it's just young people who lean a little bit more left. They often wait until election day. Maybe they forget. Maybe they like walking to the polls and seeing all the other procrastinators and feeling like myself. I have never voted in a poll like election, so I've never voted in person, and I like seeing the other procrastinators. So it's kind of fun to walk up to the ballot.
There's definitely a pronounced left shift
Totally.
in the late count in Seattle. That's become a feature of our election.
And so we will talk more about the mayor, but well, not me, but you all will. But let's zoom out and just talk about narratives. And I'm curious, Sandeep, what was the narrative in your head leading up to the election, and did it get confirmed or complicated last night?
Well, I mean, I do think this mayor's race has been drawing a certain amount of national attention, too, because it may fit in this narrative. You saw the victory of Zoran Mondani in New York City. Katie Wilson. I was joking last night. I was talking to another media outlet and saying, like, oh yeah, Mamdani, he's the Katie Wilson of the East Coast, right? They're both running as openly under the socialist label, right? As big city mayors, both running very similar campaign themes, really sort of saying the establishment has failed. Affordability is the central challenge. You guys aren't bold and progressive enough to solve the problems that we're seeing in blue cities like Seattle and New York. And obviously, both of these candidates made an enormous amount of headway. I mean, regardless of what the final outcome of this mayor's race is, I got to give credit to Katie Wilson and the campaign she has. And she came out of nowhere, just like Mamdani did. And, there are differences, right? I mean, and she's acknowledged this, he's a, incredibly charismatic candidate, and she sort of, made a kind of virtue almost of her anti-charisma, right? So that, there are differences like that, but there are some pretty fundamental similarities here too.
So Raven, what's been sticking out to you in the races that you've been following?
Yeah, I think that's, similar. It's what's been sticking out the most is this like incumbency advantage that we're normally used to seeing. Like obviously it's still there. It's not going to go away anytime soon, but I've seen a lot of folks really shift away from deferring to, oh, that's the incumbent. It's fine. Like, I don't want to change right now. I think we're seeing a lot of folks just kind of being, moved more so by the national level than what we see in these, off-year elections, and are actually ready for something different and more on this local level, and not necessarily giving, a default to the incumbent and really making them fight just like a little bit more for what, what they're used to. You could even look at the, the mayor race in the beginning, everyone was just like, we know it's going to be Bruce. And then we came out of the primaries, like, you got to fight. Like, we got to do something. I didn't work directly on this campaign, but I think it's just a really good example of the incumbency and advantage is shifting.
One other thing, if I could throw out, I mean, there's clearly a major, major, major Trump effect in these elections, just in Democratic Party politics, not just here locally, but nationally as well.
Yeah.
From a Democratic perspective, like the Trump administration is sort of the eye of Sauron, and they have, the forces of Mordor have been kind of coming at blue cities, and that has provoked a reaction. We saw it with the big No Kings rallies a few weeks ago, right? And it's played out in local elections in some interesting ways. One is there is a real anger among grassroots Democratic voters about the perceived failures of Democratic establishment politicians, not only to stand up for Trump, but to really, to be able to kind of deliver, progressive wins. And they're saying you're not delivering the wins, and therefore we're losing nationally. We want bold progressive. It's pushing voters towards demanding bold progressive change, which is obviously helping some of these younger, more ideological, more openly left or socialist challengers like Katie Wilson.
Let's talk about Sarah Nelson, was the incumbent city council president who lost, appears to be losing in her race for reelection. And then also Ann Davison, this incumbent city attorney, a Republican. But how much is that Trump effect responsible for their races? Or how much is it just kind of more things on the ground here in Seattle? Maybe they are seen as a little more conservative than the Seattle electorate, and they won because of kind of a specific set of circumstances 4 years ago.
Yeah, right. Look, the Trump effect is real, as I just said, but local circumstances matter too. And I think one of my biggest takeaways from this election versus certainly 4 years ago, and maybe even to a significant extent 2 years ago, is that the left lane candidates have changed their message significantly, particularly on public safety and street disorder messages. If you've listened to Katie Wilson talk about Bruce Harrell, she wasn't talking about, first of all, she disavowed her previous support for defunding the police and stuff like that. But even more than that, she was attacking Bruce Harrell and saying, look at places like 12th and Jackson, Little Saigon, open air drug market. Why haven't you solved that problem, Bruce Harrell? You've had 4 years. Why does it still look like a mess down there? Why are there still encampments and tents? Why are there more homeless people than ever, right, in the city of Seattle? You haven't solved that problem. And that's a very different message than what we were hearing 4 years ago, when it was like, we're going to abolish the cops and we're not going to prosecute crimes anymore, and stop the sweeps. Remember that, right? Like that stuff has sort of, fallen by the wayside. And I do think the left and sort of the progressive left has figured out a better message to connect with progressively inclined, but what I would call normie voters in the city of Seattle.
Raven, I'm curious what you're working with some leftist candidates in Tacoma, at least, I think.
And Erica Evans.
What do you think about
your firm, right?
About that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to like kind of touch back to the city attorney race as well. I mean, we have to think too, Ann Davison barely made it out her first run for city attorney. So it's not like she won by some huge margin. And a lot of folks already thought that in itself was a fluke. And so then you bring in, you bring in Erica Evans, who has very real experience, right? And more experience in the office that the current city attorney holds. And so when you have someone who is able to talk about, to Sandish's point, the messaging was really different, right? So people can't say, oh, she doesn't want to prosecute anyone. Well, she was a federal prosecutor. So like, what are we talking about here? It's about messaging, and it's about the type of experience, right? Because then on the other end of the spectrum, when you're looking at Katie Wilson and Bruce, it's like, okay, well, Bruce has a ton of experience, but a ton of experience doing what? Like, what are we doing here, right? And so I think there was a really honing in on the messaging and this like looking at how do we define experience, and so what? Like, what about this experience is applicable to the office that you're seeking? And like, how do your values align with the values of like the city? It's really interesting. I do think it really does boil down to messaging and pulling away from this like more extreme language, but still recognizing the values, and we don't have to compromise And you don't necessarily need to be the most moderate person to get everybody on board. You just need to make sure you're talking to people in a way that makes sense and resonates to them.
I think that's interesting because you didn't mention there was a Democratic Socialists of America organizer that you were also working with who's farther behind, and I think that's Zev Cook, and I think that's certainly not winning that race, and that's an interesting sort of two races to look at. I think we're talking a lot right about what candidates are saying and messaging. We're talking a lot about how voters feel. We are, of course, only talking about the voters who showed up to vote. And as of now, turnout is looking low statewide, potentially high in King County, or at least a little higher than 4 years ago. I am just kind of curious if you two are surprised by the current turnout, especially, considering the energy around, socialist candidates like Mamdani online. Raven, let's start with you. Surprised by the turnout? Not surprised?
I'm unfortunately not surprised by the turnout. It's, obviously we want everyone to be involved and engaged all the time and vote. But the truth of the matter is it takes more to get folks engaged than just knocking on their doors during election season. Like a lot of the work would need to happen off cycle, so folks can feel like you're just talking to them and about why it's important. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on educating folks on why these local races matter and how, for example, not everyone knows what a city attorney does and how that impacts their life, right? Like not everybody knows exactly what their city council person is responsible for, vice their school board. And so I think that there is a lot of education needs to be done on, what these offices do and what they mean to you as a voter and as a resident. And I think that will help drive people out to vote, but I'm not surprised.
Let me ask you about how you think Katie Wilson fits in with the other progressive challengers in Seattle, if you see any distinction, because I just thought it was interesting that Erica Evans for city attorney and Dion Foster for city council. Wilson lagged behind their races in the primary and then again in the general last night. They really swept and she, didn't do quite as well. And I'm just curious, do you think that's a reflection of Bruce Harrell, being a stronger incumbent, or does it reflect more on Wilson's candidacy in some way?
Yeah, I do think it's more a reflection of how the mayor positioned himself relative to these other candidates like Council President Sarah Nelson, who's losing, or like Ann Davis and the Republican city attorney who's getting wiped out in this election. I mean, again, Bruce sort of made some pretty significant progressive moves over the course of this campaign to shore up his left flank. He obviously worked really hard from the outset of the campaign to win over significant endorsements from either progressive elected officials or organizations like progressive labor folks and stuff like that. So I do think that's largely the driver of why the outcome in this race looks different than the outcome in those other races.
Raven, Sandeep mentioned the King County executive race, which we actually haven't talked about yet. And I'm just curious, you worked with Claudia Balducci. She is down in the early returns. And if, again, those two are very similar. So I don't know if we can expect necessarily the same swing towards some sort of further left candidate. But Gurmai Zahalai was, he gained in the primary between election day and the final results. He gained 4 points. He's already up. Do you think that he has this in the bag?
Well, I don't want to say in the bag, but well, I didn't personally work on Claudia's campaign. My firm did, but I didn't work with her. But I will say, I think I think that's going to be another one that's going to be really tough. I think today's drop is going to tell us a lot. Especially when it comes to the county executive race. And so I don't want to say anything just yet because I don't know. I don't think anyone has it like really in the bag, but I do think today will let us know, will give us a pretty clear indicator, in my opinion, because it's hard to say they're, pretty similar, messaging wise. And so I think for us who are more politically engaged and we look at this stuff every single day, I can only imagine if, I get my ballot and I'm trying to figure out what's happening, who is who, which is which. So I don't even know if a late voter would automatically say one or the other. I do think that one is going to be a toss up, but hopefully today we'll be able to get some real clarity on where some of these races are headed.
Look, I can't say for certain, But I would say definitely advantage Girmay, advantage Zahala here. And there is still something we haven't talked about. There is still a stranger effect in Seattle and King County elections, right? And Girmay is the stranger endorsed candidate. They tend to drive the votes of a lot of more progressive-leaning voters, particularly in the city of Seattle. But the city of Seattle's a third of the electorate of the King County election, right? And those later voters are going to, if they're voting the stranger line, that's going to break pretty sharply in Seattle towards Girmay. I think that kind of likely cements his victory.
We are going to talk about the stranger effect and all those things when we come back. Like has been mentioned, there things could change this afternoon. Things could change tomorrow. So, I'll put in a little plug to check our results on KUOW.org. And if anything major changes, we'll probably come back and give you a little update on this feed. So, we will be back after this break. So let's talk state legislature for a moment. We had a few D versus R races, and I wonder if the national moment has affected those too. Sandeep, let's talk about the 26th legislative district, a very expensive race for the Senate seat representing Bremerton, Port Orchard, Gig Harbor. It's a place where a lot of people work for the federal government in the Navy shipyard bases. Democrat Deb Krishnadasan is up there by about 1,800 votes. Do you think that's because the other candidate, Rep. Michelle Caldier, who has done well in the district in the past, is of the same party that runs Congress and the White House, and that voters maybe think twice about that before they vote for her?
Yes. Look, I think in Western Washington right now with Trump in office in the other Washington and the target he's put on blue jurisdictions and blue cities, the kind of very, very polarizing sort of set of policies that the Trumpies have adopted. I just think in Western Washington, in a blue jurisdiction like here, that Scarlet R is disqualifying for a lot of voters. And look, an enormous amount of money flowed into that race in the 26th legislative district, north of, $2-3 million got spent between all the outside money and the campaigns, maybe even more than that. So, and yet it looks like Krishnadasan is going to win that race relatively comfortably, even though, as you say, Caldier has been a long-time elected official in that district and won races in the past. So I do think there was a significant, kind of anti-Republican, anti-Trump backlash. That's the fundamental underlying dynamic of some of these races.
And Raven, why do you think we saw so much money poured into what from the outside can seem like these, kind of small or, boring legislative races this year? Why are people investing so heavily in those?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it goes into the bigger picture of we have to make sure we keep our majority. We want to make sure we're securing wins. And it also gives a really good indicator going into next year, right? Like midterm elections is, if you thought there was a lot of money this year, next year is going to be, I don't want to get a headache about what next year is going to be. It's going to be a lot. And so I do think a good part of this is how is this race going to play out? And is that going to be a good indicator for what we're going to see? And I think that's why you got a lot of money pouring into it. And obviously I have to agree with Sandeep on this one. Like the Trump effect was very real, especially in this race. So as soon as that Republican, has that R next to it, it's a hard pass for a lot of people, even the independents or the folks who don't really have a said party and they lean wherever. I mean, right now it's just, it's not in to be a Republican and running for office, and especially with money backing it as well. And honestly, even if it wasn't as much money going into this race, I think it would have still had a similar outcome. Without the I'm looking at the PDC, 1.3 million in independent expenditures.
One really quick thing about the dynamic in some of these high spending legislative races that, aside from the Trump stuff, is it's fallout from the last legislative session. A very bumpy legislative session. a real battle that erupted, a real rupture that erupted between the business community in particular and progressive Democrats that dominate the Democratic caucuses in the legislature, particularly over taxes and things like that. So I think a lot of the money that flowed into some of these races came from the business community and was an attempt to sort of send a message to Democrats in Olympia that, hey, you guys overreached and we want to, extract the penalty. But, and I do think in this race in the 26th, they're clearly falling short. But that drove a lot of the money that flowed into that race.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So I want to get your take on kind of what are the most powerful endorsements that you take away from the results so far. Sandeep, as of now, most of the stranger newspapers endorsed candidates are ahead. Their endorsed candidate hasn't won in the Seattle mayor's race since Mike McGinn in 2009. And they've had some changes in ownership and some struggles. But does this moment make them kind of seem like, in back being a power broker, kind of for the leftier vein of our politics and voter turnout?
Yeah, well, they've continued to be a power broker in the city of Seattle for even during this period when their candidates are not winning mayor's races. The stranger endorsement in city of Seattle municipal races is still the most, the most coveted endorsement. They basically pick the left lane candidate, right? Our races in Seattle are really a race. There's a lane for what I would call the movement left lane, and there's a center left lane, right? And they pick the movement left candidates. If there's a contested primary, the stranger endorsement is determinative of who's going to come through, right? And now that does not always translate to victory in a general election. And they have, in the last decade or so, gone very far ideologically in some of the candidates that they have endorsed. They have bypassed very progressive candidates that might have been more electable for candidates who they saw as more kind of hard-edged ideological warriors that they agreed with, right? Like, look at the 21 mayor's race. There was Colleen Echohawk or Justin Farrell, who are very progressive candidates, but running on a kind of more, I'm going to bring people together and kind of speak across divides kind of campaign. But they went with Lorena Gonzalez, who ran a much more sort of Twitter left ideological warrior kind of campaign that we are going to vanquish the other side. And she got trounced, right, by Bruce Harrell in that election, and maybe the results would have been different if they had gone differently. I do think there's a new regime at the Stranger, and they are very much priding themselves on trying to be more careful with their endorsements because I think they've felt stung by the criticism they've received, including from the left, about making endorsements of candidates that turn out to be, all but unelectable in the past.
And Raven, what about like outside of Seattle? How important are endorsements to the candidates you've worked with? Would you make any distinction between like which key newspapers or unions or interest groups, organizations like that?
Yeah, so I mean, outside of Seattle, obviously The Stranger and the Seattle Times, those are like the key. You got to get one of the two, right, to have a fighting chance. Outside of Seattle and like especially in Tacoma, we have the Tacoma News Tribune, but it doesn't hold as much weight as far as endorsements, right? So a couple of the candidates that they endorsed, they didn't make it through, or I mean, even their endorsements are behind a paywall, right? So it's really different when it comes to newspaper endorsements. And then it really is more driven by like union endorsements, labor, getting environmental support, and really looking at the organizational like aspect of it, and then really balancing it with community support and like community leaders that maybe just a couple of people really know, but they're very influential. And so making sure you get that support. And then if you can get tribal support, being able to get some kind of tribal support, they don't play in every single race, but behind the scenes, they may know someone who knows someone. So it is a little bit different. The weight of it is different. And then, like LD support outside
That's
of
legislative district party groups. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Some people don't know what LD means.
Yeah.
Let's retake that. The legislative district party support, it varies, right? Not every LD or every legislative district has the same amount of like cohesiveness or have the same amount of funding or or structure. And so for out here, if you don't get it, it's not the end of the world. You'll be all right. But in other areas, you have to get something to show that you're a Democrat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we had a situation in the King County race where one of the candidates said he disavowed any party affiliation and lost the endorsement from one of the Democrat LD groups, which are, again, like the most basic unit of grassroots party groups. And they're like the atoms to me. I don't know. I just made that up. But and then, he lost. He lost by a lot. That was Peter Kwan. He's losing to Stephanie Fain, who was endorsed by the Democrats in the King County council race down there. So there's so much we have not talked about. We do not have time. And unfortunately, we don't have time because we got to end with the really annoying pundit question about what this says about next year's midterms. And I'm sorry we got to end on that. But, you're pundits. We're all, in a way, pundits. I asked Amy to unlock her inner pundit this morning, the most annoying parts of ourselves. I am curious based on what we've seen today and yesterday, and in the coming weeks, both locally and nationally, what do you think the flavor of the 2026 midterm election will look like? And Raven, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that, well, I know we can't talk about it, but I'm so proud of Noreen. I worked with her on her campaign. That was a hard fought race right there.
Against Conrad Lee in Bellevue for city council.
Yeah, against Conrad. But I mean, I bring that up because I do think that, moving into next year, and again, I spoke about it before about the incumbency advantage. It's not necessarily the same as what we're used to seeing. And next year, I mean, it's not going to be like a walk in the park for Democrats. And I'm hoping that folks don't get the illusion that they could just kind of walk in there and be anti-Trump and like that is enough. I think really what this shows is that, yeah, if you're a Republican, you got to fight a lot harder and, probably really early on disavow anything that's Trump related. But on the other end, and like really more importantly, is that Democrats and anyone to the left, it's not just about being anti-Trump. It's like, what else are you bringing? What are your hard lines? Like, people want to know who you are, what you stand for, and not that you're really concerned all the time with meeting everybody in the middle. I think that this year really showed you want to work with folks, but like, so what? Like, what else is going on, right? Like, we have very real problems at every level of government in every area. And so what are you going to do to fix that? So I think next year it'll be a lot of, incumbents are going to have some work to do. It feels good. It's exciting. I think it's also hopeful. And I'm hoping that really helps, galvanize folks to actually get out and vote. But it also shows that we got work to do to make sure it's a continuous drumbeat of like what it is that we stand for as a party, especially in Washington, and that we have to protect it. And everything is not a guarantee because some folks may also feel like, well, we got it in a bag. What am I getting out to vote for? So it's a fine line there. It's a balance.
Yeah, two things. One, we're seeing this not just locally, but nationally. We are seeing anti-Trump backlash energy starting to build on the Democratic side, right? And midterm elections, the outcomes of midterm elections are often determined by who turns out, which side is more motivated to turn out and their people show up. It's different from a presidential year election where almost everybody ends up voting, right? And right now, the energy really seems to be building on the Democratic side. That's a good sign for Democrats going into the midterm elections. On the other hand, it's, I don't think, an exaggeration to say almost a war within the Democratic Party going on right now about what does the party stand for, right? What does it mean aside from being opposed to Trump? What do we mean? What do we stand for? There is a real division, and we saw it in these races. Mamdani's, a Democratic socialist. Katie Wilson proudly wears the socialist label here, and she may win the Seattle mayor's race. On the other hand, we had two gubernatorial candidates on the Democratic side who are winning big in New Jersey and Virginia who represent a very different vision of the Democratic Party, right? Abigail Spanberger is a former CIA agent who's talking about, being less partisan and more moderate and centrist. And same with Mikey Sherrill, who's winning big in New Jersey, bigger than I expected. Again, former helicopter pilot from the military, right? They're miles apart from Zoran Mamdani and Katie Wilson in their message and their substance. So that debate within the Democratic Party, I think, is going to continue into this next year.
Thank you both so much for turning on your inner pundit and also keeping it local and interesting to people who have just filled out their ballots and are curious what the impact is on their lives and their school boards and everything. Sandeep Kaushik, you're a political consultant, but you also go on podcasts, Seattle Nice and Blue City Blues. You are a co-host of both of those podcasts. Raven Tyler, you're a political consultant with Northwest Passage Consulting, and you probably do many, many other things that we could enumerate. But thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for
having us. Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for Sound Politics today. Today's show was produced by Sarah Leibovitz. Our editor is Catharine Smith. I'm Scott Greenstone.
I'm Amy Radil. And hey, while you're here, consider donating to Sound Politics. It's donations from listeners that allow us to do this work and keep bringing you the information you need about what's happening in this Washington and the other one.
That's right.
We have to buy Sandeep a lot of Diet Coke. It's just, it all takes resources.
With
that tax that they put on sodas.
That's right. Coffee for Raven. It's the budget's off the hook. So you can find information on how to donate in our show notes. And thanks.
Thank you. See you next week.